They're not. Let's see here. Hear me at all. They're coming in now.
All right, one in the waiting room. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our budget allocation model forum for 23-24. So actually, there's quite a few people. I see 43 people have joined the Zoom call. So hopefully we'll entertain you for the next hour. So you'll be hearing from myself. I'll be the kind of the moderator. Cashew Vyas, our Executive Director of Fiscal Affairs, will be doing the bulk of the presentation. And then you'll be hearing from Henry, Terry, and Stephen kind of on their site-specific allocation process over at the campuses. And then I'll kind of follow that up with kind of how we do it at the district office. So next slide. So on the agenda today, we'll be going over the budget timelines, the state budget process, the district's budget process, our internal resource allocation model, which we refer to as the RAM, changes that we've had this year specifically to the RAM. So if you've attended in the past, we'll kind of just talk about if there's any changes. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other funds that don't go through the RAM. As I mentioned, the budget officers at each campus will go through the allocation process at each of the budget centers, and then how you can stay connected. Before we jump right in, though, I just want to make sure everybody kind of understands why this is important. And there's a couple of reasons. First and foremost, is part of, and we've just gone through at both of our credit institutions, the accreditation process. So this is one of the key steps in terms of our communication process of getting information on how dollars are allocated and how we receive dollars as a district. So that's what's kind of really important, so all of you can understand how we actually receive dollars and then how we allocate those dollars amongst our budget centers. Hopefully, after we go through the presentation today, that there'll pique an interest in kind of the budgeting process, and maybe some of you might get interested in participating in our Council on Budget and Facilities, our District Consultation Council. So we're going to get started. We'll kind of jump into the budget timeline. So Cashew, did you want to take it?
Thanks, Fred. Can everybody hear me? I had to switch over to my headphone because I also had an unstable warning.
Yeah, we could hear you.
Perfect. Thanks, Henry. So I'm going to turn my video off in a second just because I've got too many things open. But I did want to let everybody know that the Q&A is available for all participants to ask questions. You can throw your questions in there, and we will try our best to either answer them during the forum, or if they're more appropriately answered in a separate Q&A or a response separately, we'll get back to you with that information. And we'll post the Q&A, or we'll try to post all the Q&A answers on our website as well. The information for the forum and the PowerPoint for the forum will be posted on the district website. So let's see if I switch out the screen view, you can see hopefully our website, and it will be on the budget documents website. So you go to departments, fiscal affairs, and find the budget page, and it will be posted here. Instead of a link to the thing, you'll see the actual link to the YouTube video, which is what we're going to be recording today, and the PowerPoint presentation that I'm taking you through right now. So let me turn off my video, and I will keep going and see you all later. One of the things that I found really interesting when I started learning about budgeting at the district and community colleges was how long the process takes. The budget timeline is almost the entire year of information, and we start the new year anxiously awaiting to see what the governor's proposed budget looks like. So all community colleges and K-12 and UCs and CSUs are all looking for this information because it impacts how we're going to set the tone for the very next year. So we're not even done with the year that we're in before we start to recognize what's happening for the coming year. And this first proposal is the opportunity for us to see what things the governor thinks our priorities for his administration, whether it is funding community colleges, funding other programs. Over the years, especially during the pandemic, we did have a lot of different programs that were priorities, especially to help community colleges keep students and outreach to students. So we were able to see what the tone is going to be for us as well. Sometimes it's very rosy, sometimes it's neutral, but for the most part, it stays the course. At the same time that happens, we start working on developing our budget assumptions. So these are all the different things, the calculations that underlie our budget that we're going to use to build next year's budget. We look at our revenue estimates to start with because we need to know how much money we might be anticipating being able to use toward our expenses. And then we'll start looking at all of our different calculations for expenses. The first one that we focus on is our positions. Our permanent positions and our additional adjunct and hourly costs are all incorporated into our initial assessment of what our budget might look like. Once we know what our FTS targets might be and what our FON calculation looks like, we also can determine how much of our expenses might be added or reduced based on the way that classes might be set up, how many full-time faculty, how many adjunct faculty can we have on board to cover these costs and to reach these targets. The rest of our calculations are focused on operating allocations. And I think that the majority of people who are on this webinar or workshop are used to thinking about these operating allocations. This is what it takes for your departments to operate, plus what it takes for the campuses in the district to operate. So these are all the other expenses outside of permanent people and hourly staff. These are all the things, we buy supplies and we're trying to get software, we get equipment, all of that stuff is built into these models. We need to, sign up for consulting services or I don't even know the tons of things that we all do, travel and expenditure items in here. So all of that we start with a very early presumption of what they might look like so we can get a feel for where we stand in terms of our budget. And during this time, what's happening is that the governor is having to take a look at his budget. There is no such thing as, I'm the boss and I told you what the budget's going to be as far as the governor is concerned. Because he says, here's what I think we should do. And literally everybody comes and tells him why that's not a good idea. And so he's spending his time here trying to take a look at all of the things that other people, other organizations, the legislature, even community colleges advocate for themselves. The Department of Finance lets him know how things are going to look, and he looks to see what can he keep and what is he going to have to compromise on. And so all of that results in a May revise. And at the time of the May revise, we also get updated revenue projections from the state. As you know, California taxes pay a large portion of government fees. And we would know around May what the tax rolls look like. How do they come in? Did they come in as expected? Are they short, lower than expected? What does it look like? And so it's all the tax. It's property taxes, sales tax, income tax, everything that we could get that helps fund the government is included in this May revise. So if you see that revenues start to decline, you may see a more negative May revise. If you see that revenues are staying pretty stable, you might see that the May revise looks very close to his proposed budget. So we are interested in knowing what's happening, and we're looking now. It's the end of April. We're looking for that May revise to come out in the next month, and we will definitely start updating very quickly all this information. So what happens for us is that this comes in, and then the ball starts rolling really fast. We do an updated position control budget roll. Our HR department works on putting that together, letting us know based on negotiations and where everybody is on the salary schedule, what the positions will look like and how much it should expect to cost us, including benefits, including healthcare costs. I also do some analysis on what healthcare premium increases might be because we don't get those until like October. We also have all the campuses input their tentative budgets. So these are a little deceptive when you think about that's the budget, because this is almost like a placeholder budget. It's a budget that we use to start the year. You have to have something. We're government. Just like the federal government, just like the state has to have a budget to start the year, we also have to have a budget to start the year. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at information, see what we think our revenue projections look like, how much is position going to cost us, and then we will put in a budget that's very close to probably the prior year's budget, maybe with some ups or downs to account for total increases or decreases in revenue. And then we'll start the year. So it's literally a placeholder budget, but we do know that the governor has to enact the state budget the following month. So we are looking for that final set of numbers. What's COLA going to really look like? We won't know until that budget is enacted. What are any additional resources that might be coming through for community colleges? We won't know until the state budget is enacted. And we also take our tentative budget to the board at that point, and then we start rolling toward the actual budget. So I know it seems really weird. I came into the community colleges and like, you don't even know what your budget is until September, but this is why. So you come in, you do a tentative budget, but you don't even know what your revenue numbers really look like until June, and then you have to close the books. So our accounting departments across the district, and I think all of the departments, honestly, across the district, are focused in May and June and July on making sure all their information has been completed. All your payroll redistributions. This is why we bug you to death about them, because we only have July to do them, and you got to get them all in. All the travel expenditure reports, all your invoices. You couldn't, buy everything as quickly as you can in April and May because we need to pay it by June and July so we can close the books. Then we start on our actual final budget. So we take all the information that we've got for position control, all the permanent positions, all the class schedules. We try to do our best to look at our FTS targets and what adjunct faculty costs might be to be able to provide those classes, and then any other expenses we have that are supportable within the budget we have. We put that in, and we go to the board. So we're required to have published our budget and have had it approved by the board in September. So in a lot of ways, a lot of these timelines are driven by the fact that September, that first board meeting in September, we are required to do a public hearing for the budget, and the board must approve a budget at that point. So that's kind of like the fact that, it feels like it's a nice slow time of the year, except for budget people who are frantically trying to keep their eye on the target in September.
So, catch you a couple of comments. While this is a very simplistic budget timeline, there's some other key dates in there. In February, we get our first indication of, because we put in our attendance report, what our actual revenues are going to be. There's another one when we submit in April, our FTES for essentially the year. We'll get what we call the P2 information. And the state is at the same time that is looking to see how their projections are doing. Is there sufficient dollars? Is there not sufficient dollars? And we'll talk a little bit about there's sometimes deficits. Right now, when we received the information in February, it essentially said the state doesn't have enough money to pay us. So they're essentially saying 3.5% we're going to short you on. And so we won't actually know what we are receiving in the year till the February after the year is over. So it's quite some time. And then we there's a settle up. The other thing I wanted to kind of mention was under this analysis, revisions, and negotiations. This is very in-depth. Actually, today, the California State Assembly had their Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3 on education finance meeting today, and the community colleges were on the agenda. So they were having discussions on the student center funding formula, the nursing program proposals, kind of looking at maybe taking back some of the monies that we were allocated in previous years. So this was all being discussed with our legislators, and we had our lobbyists there. They kind of spoke on our behalf, essentially looking for a modification in the student center funding form. So all of this is going on, and while we're just one district, all 72 community college districts and unions, everyone else is kind of expressing their opinions kind of on what's working, what's not working, and the recommendations. So all of this is kind of going on behind the scenes to what we're going to actually see in the May revision. That's kind of the next big key date. Thanks, Keshu.
Thanks, Fred. as you can tell, there are times when you'll talk to me or any of your budget people and they won't know what year they're in. It's because we're thinking about next year, but we're living in this year and we're probably already settling up last year. So sometimes I don't know which budget I'm talking about. That happened this morning with Fred and me. He was talking about one year and I was on the current year. So let's take a look at this information. Fred mentioned this just now, that there's a lot of work that goes into it, and I wanted to let you know that the governor's budget is available for anybody to look at as soon as it's released. The governor put the proposed budget out on his webpage in January. The May revised is posted as well about mid-May, and then the enacted budget, as soon as it's enacted, is put out as well. The governor does accept analysis and input from various groups, including the legislature. So everybody who's got skin in the game for their area, you'll see them lobby for the things that are important to them. And he even will accept analysis from the public, which is surprising because you're like, how do I get access to that? There are, I guess, various ways in which to provide feedback. Obviously, it's rare for a lot of people to provide that feedback, but I think he has to react to whatever information he gets. And the Department of Finance puts in the work on the analysis to help the government understand what's happening with the changes to the budget that might be needed. For community colleges, we do have a variety of groups that provide a lot of analysis and information on how the budget will impact our system. They'll work with various other groups such as the Community College League of California, the Association of Chief Business Officials, and ACCA, which consists of community college administrators, to prepare a joint fiscal analysis. So if you are on the state budget website or the chancellor's office, the CCCC, what is it, 5 C's and an O.edu website, that website, their budget website, has a lot of good information, including a joint analysis that is prepared by organizations that I just mentioned that are focused on community college business. And each of the groups that are providing input, they provide their information on their take and the impact of the budget, and that information is available, as I said, on the various different websites for each of those different organizations. So if you're interested in information that's out there, you can just sort of, Google California budget, and I'm sure a ton of people have a lot to say. And each one has a different focus on what they're looking at for the budget. And it's a nice way to not have to be overwhelmed with the budget information, but try to find pieces that maybe focus on school, or if you're focused on healthcare, if you're focused on, other components of the budget information. There are groups that focus on those areas to help make it a little bit more manageable and palatable, I think, to understand.
Well, from that last slide, Cashew, the two important things is the Department of Finance is really the staff of the governor, and the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, is the staff for the Senate and the Assembly. So that's kind of how it's set up. So I just wanted to add that piece of information.
Perfect. That explains a lot about the information we get from them. So that's the state's process. And now we'll try to slide over to the district's budget process. And when I talk about the district, whenever I say the district by itself, I mean the entire district, all y'all and me as well, NOCCCD. And if I say district services, that's one of the budget centers. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So I don't know if all of you all are aware, but the budget is not something that Fred and I put together in the back room with some alcohol, which would be a great way to put the budget together, a couple of drinks, a couple of margaritas. We might have some really interesting budget choices. I think I might get more people to join us in a budget discussion if we had that. But that's not how we do things here. So the way we do budget is that we get input from a variety of groups. And of course, the key group that you would think of is the budget officers group. All of your campus budget officers, so your VPASs and Director of Administrative Services, are involved in this group, as are your accounting managers on your campus and the district as well. We get together every other week to talk about issues and to make sure that we understand what we're seeing for the budget and how it impacts each of our different budget centers. We also have a facilities committee that meets periodically to provide input, to CBS. So the Council on Budget and Facilities is where we try to start a lot of the district-wide discussions on sending out information to people on the budget. And that Council on Budget and Facilities, similar to the DCC, the District Consultation Council, is comprised of representatives from all the different, I think, groups: United Faculty, AdFac, CSCA, Confidentials, and Management, as well as the budget officers, all participate in these groups. So you do have representation, regardless of which group you're in, and we do have students as well participating in this group, and the groups are open to the public. So the schedule is listed on our websites, and you are welcome to participate in that in any way that you can. If you just want to come and listen to what we're saying, the agendas might be of interest to you, you're welcome to do so. And you don't even have to share an opinion. You can just come and listen and grab a handout, no problem. But what happens is we are recommending parties to the chancellor. So CBF will provide information on budget, on facilities, activity, and recommend things such as what the assumptions look like and what other funding items might be happening, and we'll recommend that up to DCC. DCC will consider that and, if appropriate, recommend to the chancellor. The chancellor also takes feedback from other sources, just like the governor. The chancellor takes feedback and input as needed from other sources as he feels appropriate, and then recommends to the Board of Trustees, who is ultimately responsible for approving budget decisions at the district. We also, like I said, and I don't know why, I know we're recording this, and I'm not trying to make myself out to be an alcoholic, but I'm just thinking about things like there's all these shows where you see like the lawyers, at the end of the day with, what is it, like a scotch and a cigar, and they're hanging out in their offices. We're not doing that, but we do have policies to follow when we're doing these budgets. So we're not just making it up out of thin air. We have some board policies related to it and some administrative procedures that drive the reasons why we do provide budget information, including this forum. And then we do have to communicate the budget out as well. So we put out a budget allocation handbook to explain our overall process, and that was on that budget website that I explained to you earlier. They also are required to schedule our annual campus-wide budget forums, which is this one, to communicate the budget allocation model. And the intention here is to try to provide a really high-level understanding of our budget process so that you can start to understand all the different pieces that relate to it as it whittles down to your department level. And then we also do communicate in there, as well as at the different committees, any changes that have been made to the resource allocation model. We also have, I guess, an underlying driver of linking budget with planning, and that's sort of driven by ACCJC's standard. It does have a standard that speaks to evaluating and improving the use of resources. So our ongoing discussions of the budget in terms of the different committees, as well as our discussions of the one-time funds, is also to link budget to planning. So as we prepare the budget book, it also provides information on the components of the overall budget, again, linking it to the components of trying to say, this is how we're planning, this is what decisions have been made that have led to that budget. So a lot of times what I think the confusion is when we discuss the budget is we have had pre-discussions at various levels on the personnel we're going to hire. So when I provide to you the cost of that personnel, I'm not asking you for agreement on that. We've already agreed to hire those personnel. Could you imagine if your job was dependent upon somebody in a committee agreeing to keep hiring you? So no, we take the permanent positions and we make sure that those are budgeted. And I think those are the decisions that are made way in advance of the budget book being published and put together, because we need to know what faculty will we have next year, what classified staff will we have, what confidential positions will we have, how much adjunct faculty are we expecting to have. Those decisions are organizational decisions, and we present that in the budget book, and the CBF and all the discussions prior to that lead up to that conversation.
So the next few slides that we're going to be going over, we'll talk about the internal resource allocation model, which we refer to as our RAM. And I'm going to summarize kind of how the whole thing works and kind of how I think about it. If the site earns it, they keep it. We charge back for at 9.25% for district services. We have, and we all of the budget centers pay in to cover district-wide expenses. And then there's some moving around of dollars between some of the budget centers, primarily with NOCCCD, because they're on different sites. And while they get to keep the revenue, they have to contribute to some of the expenditures. So kind of the next bunch of slides, you're going to just hear what I just described kind of in 30 seconds of how it all works. But the key takeaway is the site earns it, they keep it with a charge back for district services. So I'll let Cashew kind of do it in a little bit more technical terms and how the process works.
Okay. I could do that. You guys can have a cup of coffee while I'm talking about it. We'll get into our model and the process at each budget center, and the details. Any details that I go into in terms of the calculations that I'll discuss here are included in the proposed budget book. And so as we go through that section, I've tried to include the page numbers from the budget book for easier reference. And as I said, the PowerPoint will be posted online, so you don't have to quickly note it down. If you wanted to wait for that, you'll be able to reference back to those budget book pages. We're in the 4th year of implementation of our current internal resource allocation model, and our assumptions are focused on ongoing operations in the general fund, and that's what's incorporated into what I call the RAM. So what we did is, just to give you some background, we started with the resource allocation work group, which is a subgroup of CBF, and we developed these guiding principles underlying our model. These were then submitted to CBF, DCC, and to the board, who did approve along the way the guiding principles. So we still use these principles. The very first one that was very important to all of us is to recognize the district as the fiscal entity, which it is at the state level. So whether we want to or not, we are the district is the fiscal entity. But we wanted to honor the unique legacy and culture of each institution, meaning that while each budget center has its own way of handling its operations and what things do you think are important. Then we're going to use planning and goals to drive the budget process, and that's been something that you have seen a lot in the one-time funding discussions. There's been a lot of conversations on trying to ensure that we have some understanding of how we're going to allocate those funds. What goals are we trying to achieve with the use of those funds? We're also ensuring that resource allocation decisions align with the type of funding. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to get money one time, then you can only allocate it to something that's going to cost something one time. And you can't hire an ongoing expense with a one-time fund. So the idea here was to spend that dollar appropriately, and to consider the inputs and outputs of proposed budget decisions. So we're looking at what goes into it, but also how successful was the outcome? Did we achieve what we thought was going to happen? And if not, to make adjustments accordingly. And that kind of comes to the next section about regularly assessing operations and to use data to inform the decision-making and planning processes. That is to be able to provide, I think, a little bit more transparency in knowing that we're making decisions based on what's happening and communicating that out. We also want to incentivize innovation and program development. And I think during the pandemic, we've had some money coming at us from the state to try to help us be as innovative as possible in outreaching to our students and trying to have them continue on their educational journeys and return back. And I think we continue to focus on things that help us grow as a district. And you see a lot of discussions from Chancellor Breland when you go to his Chancellor Connect and other conversations and presentations that you see at the board in terms of our district trying to be more forward-thinking as well. And what is the be forward-thinking with the intention of being a destination district. So I think that's one of the ways that our principles help support that. We also wanted to take a long-term perspective. We're not trying to make decisions that in the short term seem like a great idea and are great for me, but then 5 years down the road, I'm gone and you're still here and you're like, what did she do? That's not how we're making decisions. So we want to stay, we're in it for the long haul for our people and for our students. And we want the model to be transparent, simple, and easy to explain. So even though the model is very complex, we try our best to whittle it down. And as you saw, Fred could do it in 30 seconds. And I think that was the goal, is to be able to take that high-level approach and explain it very clearly. And so here is a visual graphic of what Fred just said. The model starts at the 3 budget centers that are the campuses, because our state funding comes from students taking classes, and that money is realized by the efforts of the 3 campuses. So Cypress College, Fullerton College, and NOCCCD serve students directly, and that's what we start with, the revenues going to those 3 centers. District Services is a support organization that drives some of the vision for the district, but also provides centralized services for each of those centers. And through a conversation and evaluation, it was determined that an allocation would be made to provide District Services a portion of those revenues to operate as a service center. And then all 4 budget centers would then have to share in any district-wide expenses that we think, hit everybody. So that's the basis of our allocation model. All the money now, instead of going to a centralized pot, now goes to a decentralized pot. And then we all have to, as Fred said, live within the means of what we have. So that's a little bit of a difference from years ago to what our current model operates under. So when we look at the allocation model, as I mentioned a minute ago, it is a revenue allocation model. It incorporates our primary funding sources for revenue, which is our student-centered funding formula. I'll call it the SCFF. It's our apportionment revenues. If you've heard that before, that's how the state works. It calls our money apportionment. The state also provides some other funding sources from us, a few extra sources, such as some money to offset the cost of part-time faculty health insurance, some lottery funds. We get some mandated block grants, a few different dollars that we incorporate into our resource allocation model. We also include local revenues. So any monies that each of the budget centers might earn locally from things like fees or from enrollment activity, that's included here as well. And we use those revenues, all the revenues we can, to cover any costs we have. We use them to cover, first, we all pay off the district-wide shared costs that we've agreed to pay, and then everything else is covered by the budget center. So any personnel costs, any ongoing operating costs, any impacts of negotiation is all done at the budget center level. This is in the budget book. It is a summary of the 2023-24, so the current year resource allocation model. And I've highlighted this little section down here because it separates out sort of ongoing activity from one-time activity. And the model itself is a zero balance model. So you should see a zero balance at the bottom of this if, when we first take a pass at it, any budget center is short on funds, they then have to find additional revenue from their carryover or make adjustments in their expenses to make sure that at the bottom they're balancing out to zero. And so currently what you're seeing is the summary of those. Here's our revenues, here's our expenses, we have those chargebacks Fred talked about, and then some additional funds that have come through in terms of additional revenue that we've put in to supplement the resource allocation model expenditures. So let's look at the revenues. The model includes state and local funding. We're still primarily funded by apportionment revenues through the student-centered funding formula, so it makes up 91% of our funding. Now I'm looking at that from the 23-24 budget book. So if you were to pull that up, you should be able to go to those pages and see those numbers in more detail. Then we also have other revenues. We have state revenues and local revenues, as I mentioned, and that makes up that 9% of our overall revenues. So with the overwhelming amount of our ongoing operations being funded through the state apportionment, let's talk a little bit about the state funds and how the state funds community colleges. Let me go through this thing. It's called the student-centered funding formula. It's the state's funding formula. It's how the state funds us. It's not given, it's a calculation, and it's using a variety of different components, but it adds focus now on student outcomes. The three main components of the student-centered funding formula is in what we call enrollment or base, supplemental, and student success. The base allocation makes up 70% of the total funding. Supplemental is 20, and student success is 10. So altogether, you get 100% of your funding split out from these three different areas of ways to earn it. So the base allocation is what we used to refer to as FTES. It's traditional. It's what's based on the number of students enrolled. The calculation on the formula is a little more complex, but it's essentially FTES based. It's the full-time equivalent students that we serve in a year. The supplemental allocation is additional funding that we receive for serving the needs of populations based on like our students. If they are underserved or need additional services, then the state is providing some additional funds to help supplement the efforts that are needed to help students who maybe opportunity for low-income students, or if we need to improve equity of access, then this is the component that targets that. The student success allocation is funding that targets and incentivizes successful outcomes of California community college students. So if you were in our system prior to the pandemic, prior to our current governor, before the student-centered funding formula went into effect, you suddenly heard the phrase pathways, guided pathways. And that has become something that we're trying to see our students achieve completion. We want to see them get through their educational goal, whatever it is, whether they're trying to get a certificate here at our district or they're trying to go to a university, whatever that is, we are trying to see that happen as a state. And the funding formula has incorporated that idea into its funding itself. So it focuses on several different metrics that we have, and it even goes past the student's time in college to whether they attained a living wage post-education, because that's the focus of why community colleges and colleges and education in California are so important, is because you want people to be able to achieve a living wage based on the fact that they were able to obtain some education that helps their career. And so if you're interested in more information on these components, I will say that rather than inundate it here and speed through it, you can go through the Chancellor's website. This is what I was referring to earlier, the cccco.edu website. It's available on their Budget News webpage, and the data is available for the student-centered funding formula, as well as a lot more information. Also, for those of you who signed up for this through the flyer, you might have seen that we are going to do some follow-up sessions. And those follow-up sessions will also provide more details into each of these different calculations and what makes up that information, as well as our resource allocation model components. So there's a couple of opportunities for you to get more information as well.
Before we go, can you go back to that last slide, Cashew? Kind of a simple way to look at this is that space allocation is FTES, what we traditionally has been recorded and how revenue has come to the district. The supplemental allocation really deals with the financial aid and the number of students that we have that have the needs and are applying for financial aid. So you essentially get a bump in your allocations for those students. And the last component is how successful, how many graduations and how many certificates are awarded. So that's really kind of the way to look at this. It's broken down differently, where it was previously just FTES. Now they have the supplemental and the student success allocation added to it. So it's just kind of a simple way to think about the main components.
Thanks, Fred. So the impact of the student-centered funding formula, what is the whole point of this thing? And the idea is to incentivize colleges to support students from underrepresented communities. That's where the supplemental funding came in to encourage colleges to develop innovative programs to improve student outcomes. So the whole point is we'll reward you for your success if you can develop programs that help you focus on student success. And it shifts the focus a little bit from just enrolling students to ensuring they succeed academically and professionally. So we used to be 100% focused on just enrolling students, and now we've got 20 and 10% focus on a little bit more success and completion. And that was the purpose, I think, was to try to drive the governor's desire to see students go through completion, to allow community colleges to align their mission with that as well. So the funding drives that as well. Pardon me. So in looking at our overall calculations, we can see that our overall revenue from the student-centered funding formula, which is for 22-23, we anticipated it to be $227.5 million, that we're pretty close to what the state thinks. So this 70-20-10 split is what the state thinks we should be getting or earning, and we're kind of close. We've made good strides on FTS. We're at 70.5, and we're at a little bit over on success, which is nice. It just means that we're probably a little bit less, or maybe some opportunities for serving some of the underrepresented population of students in our district to get that section up to 20%. So it's a little bit of opportunity, but it looks like we're pretty much in line with what the student-centered funding formula intended for us to be funded based on. So that's revenues. Let's shift. So let me take a look at this. Is the piece of the same information, but broken out by college. So if you look in the budget book and you want to see how each college's base, supplemental, student success, and the true-up adjustments work for their earned apportionment, when we're thinking about the $227.5 million, this is how each center, as far as Cypress, Fullerton, and NOC, work out in terms of what they would show as their earned portion of the apportionment. Having said that, for revenues, let's shift over to the other side of the budget, the expenditures. The expenditures in the RAM break out, again, mostly toward personnel costs. The RAM overall is comprised primarily of personnel, 87% of direct personnel costs, excluding the district-wide bucket. So we have some benefit costs, the retiree benefit costs that are in here, but the majority of our ongoing salaries and benefits are in the personnel costs, and we have additional 13% in the other areas. So you can see we're really focused on people and maintaining the structure that we have to support the positions that we've got. The model also includes the end stretch of the student-centered funding formula model here. That also includes some transfers. Fred had mentioned some transfers that we might do within a budget center to supplement some programs, and also some chargebacks. So that's when one budget center provides the services that directly benefit another budget center, and we tell the other budget center, you should pay me for some of those costs. And Terry is the one who kind of has to suffer the most, I think, because NOCCCD does have the most centers at each of the different budget centers, and therefore, while we all cover each other's costs, we do have some chargebacks to align those expenses with each budget center as well.
So remember when I told you when we were going through the budget calendar that we really don't know what we got in the previous year until February after the year is concluded. But during the year, there's several times, probably around February and again in late May, we'll kind of see how the state is doing in terms of the collection of their revenue compared to the estimates. And so at certain times of the year, we will be notified that, hey, the state doesn't have enough money to pay you. It's primarily on the property tax collections. Historically, we have seen that those deficits have gone away by the time we get to May and again in February. But there's been a couple of years where we actually have had deficits that haven't gone away. One of the differences between the K-12 model and the community college models is the K-12s get an automatic backfill. We're dependent upon the legislature to actually approve a backfill, and in some years they haven't approved that backfill. So that's kind of the difference between the different models. We are also kind of taking a look at, as Cashew mentioned, you can see We're doing a little bit better on the student success metrics and compared to the supplemental metrics. And so we're able to kind of take a look to see if there's other changes that we need to make. So the point I think we're trying to make is we're always taking a look because things change rapidly, and we're always kind of doing the assessment based upon the information and data that we're getting from Sacramento. One of the things that kind of stood out when Cashew was talking about the RAM model and going through that summary, she mentioned that RAM structural deficit. And I want to just kind of, the thing I want to leave everybody with is, while we think we have a structural deficit, and for this particular year, it was quite extensive, it's really two components of that. We're actually receiving more money, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So we're not overspending. We've actually been growing our ending balance over the last few years, and I'll kind of talk about why. But in those, the structural deficit component is, Cashew mentioned that we kind of have a zero sum. We kind of look when we get to the bottom, we want to make sure the campuses have allocated all of their dollars. And so they do their due diligence, and they budget to the dollars and the numbers that we give them. So that's a component of it. But the big piece regarding why we have the structural deficit is our enrollments have dropped, and they have since improved, but they were down at one time over 30%. And while the state has a funding formula, and they put some provisions when they transferred from the SB 361 model to the current funding model, they made some provisions to kind of do the transfer over. So we've been receiving additional dollars. So while we show in a structural deficit, when we're talking about that, we're really trying to let everybody know within the organization, based upon what we're earning, this is what we see in terms of the revenue. But our revenue, and she had put up several slides where it was $227 million. That number really should be probably around 259 million. And then I'll kind of talk a little bit about, it's even a little bit higher than that because of some other provisions and changes the state made related to COVID. But can you go to the next slide, Cashew? So in that revenue number of 250 is the 227 plus other revenues. We've got expenses of the $270 million. And that includes additional, and you kind of can see $6.8 million in contingencies. So we get down to the bottom line, we're about the 27.4 million in terms of what we were reporting as the structural deficit. When we talk about the deficit factor at P1, it was 3.55%, which equates to $9.4 million for us. We do think when we get the May numbers, the P2 numbers, we're going to see better, that hopefully will be better, knock on wood, and hopefully by February that number will go away. But I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen this year based upon what we're hearing from Sacramento. It's not just taxes that they're seeing the deficit factor built up on. It also has, some of the other districts are actually experiencing growth, and as they're funding some of this, some of these dollars, more monies are going to other districts. And so there's not sufficient dollars to kind of really pay for the FTES that wasn't really generated. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now. But let's talk about some of the funds outside of the RAMs, and that's really kind of the key component for us. Next slide.
Fred, if I could just add one thing really quickly. So when we're talking about deficits and how they impact us, what does that mean? Earlier, I had mentioned the state funds us by formula, and the sources for those revenues are a variety of sources. Some of that is enrollment fees that we collect ourselves from our students is considered one of the sources of the revenues, and then the state supplements it with a few different revenue sources. If those revenues fall short at the state level, then there may not be sufficient funds to cover our calculated revenues. And as Fred mentioned, if other districts are growing, then that puts a greater burden on the amount of money that the calculations would need to fund. And so if the revenues do fall short, we watch that very closely to see kind of where are we going to sit. And so a deficit factor at P1, while concerning, we still need to see what it will translate to when it comes out to the final numbers for the revenues that do become available to states. So we do expect to see movement. A lot of times that's an early conservative number based on a lot of projections, and luckily in California we have a very robust economy, and we tend to see the deficit factor go down a little bit, not necessarily going up severely. So we would expect to see some movement in that as we move forward. Thanks, Fred.
So the big piece that we have, and I talked about the changeover from the prior funding model to the new student-centered funding formula. Originally, there was 2 years that they were giving us, so you couldn't earn any less dollars. And they came up with this concept called the hold harmless funds, and essentially saying that they're going to fund you at your 17, 18 levels of funding. So you can't really drop below that. And they would increase it by COLA. So it started out for this 17, 18 numbers plus the COLA, and it kind of moved on forward. After that, the first 2 years, and it was supposed to go away, they extended it for a few more years, and then they extended it again to kind of where we are now. So what they told us now is the 24-25 year will be the last year that we receive the hold harmless dollars. And the number has been quite significant for us. In some cases, it's over $30 million for us that we've gotten monies that we didn't earn, but because of the hold harmless provision, we were able to get those dollars. We actually kind of played the system, for lack of a better word, in terms of the hold harmless funds, because we happened to shift 2,100 FTES in the year that they were implementing the new funding formula. So we're actually being paid, I think, like 37,000 FTES when we really earned about 35 for that year. But when we shifted the FTES, it artificially increased our number. Put it in perspective, we're actually earning right about 30,000, but we're still being paid for that 35,000 FTES. In addition, there was another provision, and we kind of break down the hold harmless funding into two buckets because there's a little bit more. We were able to count our pre-pandemic FTES numbers for a few years with the emergency, and was called emergency and conditioned FTES. So we were able to artificially, again, keep our FTES higher to get additional dollars. So that's one of the reasons we were able to really accumulate the resources that we have in our ending balance. One of the requirements of getting those emergency condition funds was that we had to increase our reserve balance from 5% to approximately 17% for 2 months of operating expenditure. So it really worked out well for our district. But when we put it in perspective, because the hold harmless actually phases out after the 24-25 year, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means for us. We're not anticipating that, because a lot of the districts are out of the hold harmless, or most of the districts are not in hold harmless as far as we are still. So that's why any budget meeting that we have, when we're talking about how do we pull out of this, it's always enrollments. We've got to get our enrollments up as close as we can to our pre-pandemic numbers. So we've been receiving quite a bit of dollars in hold harmless funds that have kept us afloat for these last few years, and actually has really allowed us to increase our reserve balances. Outside of the RAM, when we really talk about the apportionment. Go up the previous slide again. We have the categorical funds. So some of you on the call are probably very familiar. We have hundreds and hundreds of different categorical programs. Those all function about with the kind of self-balancing. They have revenues and expenditures, and here's a list of, and you can see it's 229 million. It's almost comparable to our apportionment revenue, but here's where some of the dollars are coming in for the hold harmless. I probably jumped to a different slide, but that was on the slide that I was supposed to talk about. We also have, as part of the outside the RAMs, is when we're allocating dollars for a particular year, we don't always spend all of those dollars in that particular year. Everything doesn't cease at June 30th. You have things in the work where we've allocated dollars, but they're not spent. So for our district, we actually allow carryover funds. I know some districts that I'm familiar with do not allow carryover funds. They'll actually sweep those dollars, but we have a significant amount of dollars in carryover funds. And Cashew will talk more about this in just a little bit. But that's a major component in our budget, because we'll allocate approximately 100 million of that $143 million back out to the campuses or the budget centers, and so they can actually put the dollars where they need to go. The one that we're kind of most focused in on is the board policy contingencies. That's about the 17%. And Cashew will talk about the details of the ending balance in just a minute. So let's get back to, we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the other funds, but I kind of wanted to go back to that hold harmless discussion. So I mentioned the 24-25, this represents our new floor. The funding, the hold harmless doesn't go away, and that's, I think, something that's not been understood very well. When we talk about the hold harmless going away, it's still there, but it becomes our floor. But what it means for us is we won't get automatic COLA adjusted in future years until we either get our FTES up, or in a combination of getting our the COLAs exceeding. So the rates will continue, but our district won't be receiving any dollars. And you'll be able to see a simulation that we prepared for our board a little bit later that kind of shows what that is. But this is why we're so concerned about the kind of out years for the next couple of years. Is this is the last year where our district will probably be receiving COLA, probably at least up to 10%, depending upon what happens to our enrollment. So while you may hear other districts in the state getting a COLA, and yes, the rates will increase, we won't be getting any additional dollars, because we'll be receiving those dollars up to the hold harmless until we actually earn more than what we're receiving. So it's quite going to be quite a challenge. And you probably heard the fiscal cliff mentioned in publications, and if you listen to the news, a lot of districts are expecting to have this fiscal cliff. I think we haven't spent all of the dollars that we have at this point, so we're not calling it a fiscal cliff, but it is certainly going to bring some challenges. So we got a couple of questions that came up, and I don't know if you can do that calculation real quick, Cashew, on the current, but it's probably closer to 40%. But what is the $143 million represent of the overall? I'm not sure what it was, but if you can do that calculation real quick, Cashew.
Are you answering a question, Fred?
I'm asking you to do the calculation real quick rather than me guessing.
No, but are you responding to a question?
Yes, yes, it is a question that came up.
Can you read the question?
What percent of reserves do we currently have? And this is as of June 30th of last year. And Cashew, and the other question that came up was, can we explain what one FTES is? Essentially, one FTES equals 525 hours of instructional time. So that's what it means. So if one student goes 2 semesters at 15 units a semester, essentially that will be equivalent to 525 hours. So that's really what an FTES is, 525 hours. So if you have 2 students that go, 7.5 units each semester, that's still going to equal 525 hours. So that's really what an FTES is. It equals 525 hours of instruction time. So
perfect. And so 33 the 33.3 million here, the board policy contingency, as a percentage of this ending fund balance?
No, there's 33 of is the overall, when we do the calculations for the chancellor's office of total expenditures. So the one where the chancellor's office is reviewing, so it's the 143 million over the total expenditures, estimated expenditures for the year. So that's would answer the question, what percentage, that's typically how it's looked at.
Hold on, I'm pulling it up.
So we can talk, you're going to be going through this slide in just a minute, correct? I can do the, if you want to kind of
Okay, you do the
continue the
calculation and I'll
presentation,
go
do
through the details of the slide. Perfect.
Yeah.
Because it is a percentage. We base it on the percentage of expenditures based on the Chancellor's Office guidelines on what they recommend the increased board policy contingency to be. So it is a portion of what we put aside in our ending fund balance, and it is based on some of the actual emergency conditions provisions that we took advantage of during the pandemic required us to also go before the board and request the increase to the contingency. When we're looking at our ending fund balance, I think a lot of times I hear people say, we have 143.5 million ending fund balance. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, but how much of that can I access? So when I look at this, I actually start to see, from my perspective, money that's not readily available to me for me to do anything with. And I'll walk you around the circle in terms of information. So we did start with non-spendable money. So 0.2, or I guess $200,000 of it is non-spendable. It's not cash. It's some supplies that we have in stock, and we have some money that's held in an account that we use as an emergency fund for, like, if we have an emergency check that needs to get cut right away, we have some funds there. So that's $200,000 you can't spend on other stuff because it's dedicated out in those ways. We also have restricted funds. And those are things that are from fees that we might have received or funding we received, like parking fees or health fees that you can only spend on specific things. So we leave that in the restricted fund balance. Fred had mentioned categorical programs. Those
the
are
big one is lottery. There's quite a bit, our district has accumulated quite a bit of restricted lottery funds.
Yep, lottery funds. We get some in the unrestricted and some in the restricted, and those have to be used for supplies and equipment specifically identified for instructional purposes. And there's a list of things that it can and can't be spent on. And if they don't get spent in 1 year, they have to be carried over to be spent in the following year. As I was saying, Fred had mentioned categorical funds in the same idea of restricted, but those usually don't have carryover balances. Those are ones where you receive the money from a grant, you got to send it on the grant, and the grant is done. You don't get to keep that money forever. So these funds that you see here are in our ending fund balance, but they're only limited in what they can use. So that 11.1 million is not available for other purposes either. We did put aside some committed funds previously, and I left it here as zero because this year we did go to board and request that that money be released out, and we put it toward funding that board policy contingency. It had previously been set aside for what were leaps and bounds in the PERS and STRS employer rates. They'd gone from like 7% to 23%. So we were like, how are we going to fund this? So we put some money aside just in case we needed to help supplement some of our funding. But now that those rates have gotten, we think, to where they're settled a little bit more closely to where they're going to land, we were able to release the commitment that we had put aside for those funds, and it went toward the board policy contingency. Having calculated the board policy contingency at whatever percentage Fred is going to tell us it is.
About 44%. The
44%?
The 143 is about 44%. The board policy contingency, remember, that was, we still had $10 million that we still need to contribute to that number to get it up to about 43 to meet the new board policy requirements. So the 33 was only about 13% at that time, but we will be we did increase it by another $10 million in this year's budget.
So
remember, this
I think
June 30th of last year.
I think you said 43%, but I think what you meant was 43 million. Is that correct?
No, the 143.5. So there's two things that we really look at in ending balance. The one that kind of is talked about in the finance circles is your ending balance compared to overall expenditures. And that's about 44%. The one that we, as budget officers, are kind of focused in on is what is that board policy contingency? We used to have a board policy that says we would have 5% of our overall expenditures. And now the chancellor's office has changed, and as part of the requirements for the emergency condition funding, we needed to raise that up to 2 months of operating expenditures, which is probably going to be close to 17% when we get to add the additional $10 million. This was as June 30th of last year. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of overall balances. No, there's a lot of detail on this, but it's probably confusing people. But those are the two numbers when we're looking at ending balance, kind of the two areas that we're focused in on.
So it sounds like the 33.3 million is not getting
13.
us there yet. It's going to get us a little bit
13%.
more.
Yeah,
Say that again.
it's about 13%.
So 33.3 million is getting us to a 13% of the board policy level, and then we need to get it up a little bit more to get to what we think is a 2 months operating expenses.
Yeah.
Thanks, Fred. And so that's a little bit, we were using some of our excess, access to some excess additional funding to do that rather than try to reduce operating allocations. We were able to use additional funding from emergency conditions activity to do so. So that was a benefit to our district without actually a full detriment to any budget center having to find the money and resources to put that aside. We were able to do that pretty well, I think. And so moving on, we've got assigned fund balances. So these are assigned through committee. We have gone through CBF and DCC and asked for primarily one-time funds to be allocated out for specific purposes, and that list is in the budget book as well on page 65, so you can see what things have been assigned out, and page 66 provides even more detail. And then you go on to assigned fund balances, but by budget centers. And what this is something that you may be most familiar with if you've gone to your budget committees on your campuses or talked to your budget officers about, putting money aside for specific purposes and getting approval for that. That's what this is. This is money that the campuses have identified as being assigned for their campus specific purposes. And that list is also in our budget book to show what the different purposes are that are being used. So when you get through all of that, you're left with $1.2 million of uncommitted funds. And that is primarily sitting in the budget center. So these are the budget center carryovers. And then the true district-wide, if you will, unallocated resources remain at 14.8%. So these are the two pieces that at this point, when we did the budget, either the budget center said, I've got some ending fund balance that I have put aside, but I don't have a specific identified purpose for it, but I will use it as things come up during the year, or the district itself has some money that if we needed to be able to address something that came up, we would draw down upon the unallocated resources prior to being able to modify any of the other funds, especially any of the assigned funds. So when people say the 143.5 million to me, I actually, in my head, I'm like, wait a minute, where are we landing? We're landing over here.
So just some examples of the assigned fund balances. We've done a lot in terms of scheduled maintenance for contributions to construction projects. We got a couple of things that we're discussing now. We had the book program last year that was $5 million between that and doing OER. So there's things that have kind of worked its way through the planning process. So one way to look at this ending balance is Cashew had mentioned, is there's ones that there's amounts that have already been allocated, the assigned balances. There's the board policy contingency, which we're required to maintain per board policy. And then we have the restricted balances that they can be spent, but they have to be spent on restricted purposes that are outlined in whatever the agreement is. But really the things we haven't allocated at this point, the district level is just about the $14.8 million. So that's kind of, I think, a good way to look at, this is where a lot of the attention is spent. especially in collective bargaining, in terms of our ending balance. Ending balances are wonderful to have, especially in terms of when you're expecting an economic downturn. So you can first kind of deal with issues over at the campuses. The campuses can essentially go back and pull back some of the monies that they assigned if necessary. The same with the district. They could go back in and take that money back if necessary. So, but I think we are positioned pretty well to face the fiscal downturn that we're expecting, not probably so much in 24, 25, but kind of in the out years. We kind of need to move. So can you go through, I'm trying to look with the one slide
So
with
let me just remind everybody that there are other budgets and other funds that we look at in the budget book. So if you go through those areas, we've described what they are and how we handle those funds. They're separately discussed and separately handled because they're not part of our ongoing operations, but they serve specific purposes. Go ahead,
Can
Fred.
you go to slide 27 real quick?
The wrong direction.
Yeah,
Okay,
just real
yes.
quick. This is that slide that we talked about in terms of one of the scenarios that we prepared for our board, and we did put this in our budget book. But when you talk about the hold harmless, you can see in 24, 25 at the time when we put the budget together for last year, we were anticipating what happens if we got a 4% COLA and we pass through 4%. But you can see in the middle of that page where we're stuck at $270 million all the way through the 27, 28, and it's not till 28, 29 before we get any additional dollars, even though if we were to get a 4% COLA at the state, we're not getting any more additional revenues. And that's what the effect of the hold harmless is. I thought this was a request of one of our trustees, and I think it really demonstrates and shows what the impact of this hold harmless floor and the fact that we won't be receiving any additional revenue, even though we'll see COLA increases in the SCIF rates, and other districts may be talking about COLAs, but there will be COLAs, but we're not getting any at North Orange until we get our enrollments back up. This scenario here was assuming that we would generate the same FTES. I'm happy to report that we have seen some slight increases, probably 7-8%, I think, if I remember correctly, from the targets that we originally had set. So we're seeing some progress over the last 2 years. We've gained, when we were down about 30%, we've picked up about 15% over the last 2 years. So that's kind of good news. So I just wanted to kind of go over that slide 12 too. So I wanted to really thank, for those of you who don't know, Cashew is going to be retiring in June 30th. And so she was very instrumental working through the shared governance in terms of putting the resource allocation model. She's kind of our resident experts on the resource allocation model, and that's why we kind of have her do most of the presentation. So if you have any questions that you're dying to ask, you get them to her before June 30th so she can answer them for you. So now we're going to kind of turn it over to Henry Waugh, our Fullerton College Vice President of Administrative Services, to kind of quickly go through Fullerton College's allocation process.
Yeah, thank you, Fred and Cashew. So looking at our budget, we take a number of different factors into account when we allocate budgets once the district finalizes the amount to be given to the campus. As you heard earlier, we don't use a zero-based budget model. We use a kind of a roll budget, and then we make adjustments, right? So at the beginning of the budget development process, we work with our instructional team to determine the projected FTES that may be based on past history or upcoming scheduling practices to really begin determining what our foundational revenue is going to be. So as Cashew mentioned and illustrated about our student-centered funding formula, a majority of our revenue is still coming from FTES from the SCFF. Coming out of the pandemic, we're really trying to understand the enrollment trends and what our new normal is going to be. So these transition years affect the end of year settling of the budget due to the decreases in revenue because of the decreases in FTES, right? Students coming in. But we're seeing an upward trend in their enrollments, which is a positive sign, and we're working collectively to develop opportunities to get this upward momentum going into an upcoming academic year as a campus. So we're working together to do this in all the different areas. Our hopes is that an attainable gap that we can work together as a campus to meet the needs of the community and students' educational journeys, and really meeting our projected revenues that we need to kind of bring our campus back whole. So to begin the close of the books throughout the summer into end of July, we kind of look at different factors. As discussed earlier, President's Cabinet looks at trends, enrollment outlook, strategies, and really want to get the commitment going into upcoming fiscal year to meet the needs of our student population. Other factors that we look at in previous years is fiscal performance. How did we do? What is our carryover? How does it affect our, what is in our master planning documents, instructional and non-instructional program review, campus-wide priorities, our technology plan, facility needs, right? All of those have to come together so that we can kind of figure out what our, where to put our money that best kind of gives us biggest bang for our buck, right? There's just some items that we need to review and really taking a holistic look at the needs of the campus. So as you saw from Cashew's slides, a majority of our expenditures are personnel and salaries. So the primary reason why we wrote a budget is because personnel is such a large part, and it's just easier to move in and make sure that those are earmarked. So we have a commitment to our employees to make sure funds are earmarked for salaries and benefits to our to make sure that it's working towards the next moving into the next fiscal year. We meet with all of our divisions and departments to look at the current year budgets along with the 5-year look back to see and discuss if there are any needs adjusted based on what is allocated in funds that are currently residing in the budget centers. We're also making our rounds to all the different areas to make sure everyone is aware of what their current budget looks like. So you'll see Anita and I making appointments with all the division deans, program managers, vice presidents, and really kind of look at a holistic historical view of all the spending that's happening and see if there's movement within the current allocations and if we need to make some adjustments. So next slide. So once we put together the budget, it includes certain assumptions and other factors as discussed earlier. Certain decisions need to be made in terms of growth years, what we do with additional revenue, and during times of decline, how do we mitigate the loss of revenue? So right now, as you heard, we're kind of in that decline state, but we really want to make sure that as a campus, we work together in trying to stabilize our funding. So even though currently we are not at the levels of the peak years, our campus and organization has made a commitment to stabilize the funding. So as you heard from Fred, our hope is to be able to keep where we're at, but use that upward momentum to kind of close the gap. So that's the work that we're doing currently. So budget outlook and process updates are shared with our collegial consultation groups in September at the beginning of the academic year, right? These items are shared with our collegial consultation committees, beginning with planning and budget, so PBSC, and then as a recommending body to PAC, which is our President's Advisory Council, to ensure that information is disseminated and transparent. Following the budget development timeline, tentative budget is usually during June, proposed budget with development happening in August and through September. Once finalized proposed budgets are near completion, we go to PBSC again and PAC to give updates on the upcoming fiscal year's outlook. We always submit a recommendation once accepted that goes to the Board of Trustees for approval and adoption for the budget year mid-September as a district. So as you can see, there's many considerations in the creation of this budget. There's not just just putting money where it needs to be. It's our goal to use ongoing revenues to cover ongoing expenses, and then looking at program review allocations or one-time allocations using one-time expenditures. So all in all, that's the way that we look at our budgets and in collaboration with our district folks.
Thank you, Henry. So now next up, we'll hear Terry Cox, our Director of Administrative Services for NOCCCD, kind of talking about NOCCCD's allocation process.
Okay, thank you. So yes, so NOCCCD, we also start looking at our budgets as soon as the January proposed budget starts coming out. And our drivers for our budget process, it's our institutional mission and goal are the true foundation for our financial planning and the budget development. And then we also do consider our NOCE strategic plan, which that is, that's what helps us establish our goals. The district master planning priorities. We have a huge grant, the regional adult education consortium goals, and then other considerations at the local and state levels. Next slide. So once we consider all of those factors, then under the direction of our president, the planning process considers the needs of our students, available resources from multiple funding streams, and our personnel costs. And again, with the current revenue, based off of our FTS, because of the decline in our FTS and our decrease in our budget, looking at our multiple funding, other multiple funding streams is very important. We also have two primary shared governance committees, which is President's Cabinet and our Budget and Facility Planning Committee. And so these two committees, again, it's a shared governance, so it includes faculty, classified staff, management, and students. And so the Budget and Facility Planning Committee coordinates and approves a priority list for new classified and management positions. And then we make a recommendation to the president. And we do that on an annual basis. And in addition, this committee also reviews and approves one-time funding requests such as instructional supplies and equipment for our programs. We also have a departmental planning and review cycle, and it includes sections for resource requests based on key performance indicators and demographic data. And then the department leads can request resources using existing procedures. And so again, we take all that into consideration and then decide what available resource funding streams can accommodate all these requests. And then the Academic Senate representatives join the campus executive team in determining the priority list for faculty positions. Next slide. And so NOCCCD's current year supports the majority of ongoing expenses. And again, it is mostly salary and benefits for the permanent positions and adjunct faculty and our department operating budgets. If there is funds still available, then we can budget for any reserves for personnel contingencies and any other reserves as needed. If there are no reserves in our current year fund, then we do have our carryover fund that we leverage off of. And so I work very closely with president staff, program managers, and the North Orange County Regional Consortium for Adult Education, that director, to monitor expenses and to ensure that we're in compliance with federal, state, and local fiscal policies and regulations.
All right, we'll hear from Stephen Schoonmaker, our interim vice president of administration over at Cypress College.
Thanks, Fred, and good afternoon, everyone. So like the other two main budget centers of the colleges, NOCCCD, Fullerton, we really look at our budget priorities first, kind of looking at it as the basis that a budget is not just a collection of numbers, but it's an expression of our values and aspirations based on our priorities and our goals to fulfill our mission. So we look at budgeting as part of our planning process. We look at program review. We look at our campus services programs, those reviews. And then we establish priorities based on both the district and the college's strategic plans. So we're always looking to maintain our academic programs, preserve comprehensive student support services, and attain efficiencies, maximize effectiveness, support our DEIA efforts, things like the Charger bus pass is an example, the book pass, the food pass that we've done in the past. For instruction, we want to be focusing on priorities similar to the Vision 2030 from the Chancellor's Office, looking at areas like dual enrollment, our involvement in CVC. Once we build these kinds of priorities, we share those with our Planning and Budget Committee. In fact, at the last Planning and Budget Committee, we had an initial review of our draft budget priorities for this following year, as well as our President's Advisory Cabinet, which will be meeting tomorrow, and we will be looking at those priorities there as well, sharing and gaining input as we finalize those. Next slide. And then we start a departmental budget manager submission process based on those program reviews and priorities. After the third quarter, which ended in March, we share information with budget managers of the last 3 years of expenditures, and then an opportunity for each budget manager to look at what submissions they would make for building the budget for the following year. Then we compile those and we review those with the executive team, PVC, and PAC. And then we get first we get our tentative budget, the kind of placeholder budget that Cashew referred to earlier, and then build that into the final budget that's approved in September. We have regular meetings, check-in meetings with budget managers and their budget personnel. Over the last 2 years, we've been working on those to be 4 times during the year. And then we do operate with a 2-year cycle that allows those budgets that can conserve expenditures in the current year, then those are carried over to be utilized for the next year. And that kind of allows us to have some stability and less fluctuation from year to year as we use those carryover funds. And that's a quick overview of our budget process here at Cypress.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm Fred Williams. I don't think I introduced myself, but I'm the Vice Chancellor of Finance and Facilities. So I'll kind of briefly explain how the district services allocation is done. So we mentioned when we were looking at the overall RAM that district services is allocated about 9.25% of the RAM. So whatever the campus earns, then 9.25 goes to district services. And we have 5 budget centers within district services: the Chancellor's Office, including the Board of Trustees, Public Information Office, Finance and Facilities, Human Resources, and Educational Services and Technology. We go through, similar to the campuses, the first priority area is making sure that we have salaries and benefits covered. And then we do an allocation to each one of the budget centers in district services, but we really kind of focus in on existing contracts, and the expenditures are pretty consistent within district services. So we know what contracts are that we're going to be utilizing, and so we make sure we have sufficient dollars in those contracts, and then we kind of see where we're at, and we make adjustments on a year-to-year basis. So anything that's kind of outside the norm, we do have a kind of a group, district services, which is made up all the department heads, and we kind of go through and talk about what those ongoing needs are going to be. For the one-time funds, we do have carryover funds. We do usually every year. Sometimes with COVID, we kind of got pushed off to every couple of years, but I know we're kind of working on that right now, the administrative review process, and that's supposed to identify any of the one-time needs. And so that's the process that we use. So if anybody that's on the call in district services, if they have something that we need to fund, we need to kind of go through your supervisors to get to the budget, to the budget centers or chancellor staff member, like for myself in finance and facilities, Emma for human resources, and Sherry Lee Bug for educational services and technology. It kind of works its way through, and then we make the allocations to make sure that we have the dollars. And so we do have a significant amount of carryovers that we use. We do fund other things. For example, where carryovers had accumulated within district services, and so we're going to be doing the boardroom remodel out of district services carryover funds. So that's kind of the big pieces of the budget. So I didn't see any additional questions, but that's kind of how we do the budgeting. And Cashew will kind of talk a little bit about how to stay connected.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, everybody. I think that we tried to give you a high-level overview of how the processes work and some information that lets you see that you can get involved at the various levels, including at your campus, including at the district level, and we welcome you to join us to learn as much as you would like to and share your thoughts as well. So there's ways to stay connected. I've listed some of those out here, and also you can look at the statewide level as well. I did want to remind you all that this year we are doing something a little different. Came out of a suggestion from last year's budget allocation model forum, which was to do some smaller targeted sessions. So we have 3 sessions scheduled, one for each Friday starting May 3rd. So we have May 3rd, 10th, and 17th. If you would go through Advantage, you can register for those sessions, and what they're intended to be will be a look at the metrics that underlie the student-centered funding formula, as well as our resource allocation model components. And we have left time for questions, no matter what they are. I know that many of you submitted some questions. We appreciated that. We'll try to put the Q&A on the website, but you have an opportunity there to also ask those questions, whether they're budget related. We'll try to keep the information 50-50. So some information on the student-centered funding formula, and then opportunities for you all to ask whatever other questions you might have. If we can answer them, we will do so there. So please go through Advantage and do that so you have an opportunity to expand. I think whatever information you're trying to obtain, we'll do our best to reach it. Dr. Gabrielle Stanko and Anita Carlos, Fullerton College and District Services researcher, combination with myself will be there, so you'll get a good perspective from the campus level, from the district research level, and from the district budget level. And so we hope that you'll join us there. I think that's the majority of what I've got, Fred. If there's any questions for anybody that we didn't get to, you feel free to email me with those questions. If you're having trouble with logging on to the registration, if you email me, I'll also forward the information over to you. We can get you registered as well. So I think that's pretty much what I've got.
Cashew, did we get some upfront questions that we didn't answer?
I think we did, but we are out of time. We're like 4 minutes over time, so I think we're going to end that here. And we did answer some of the questions throughout the presentation, and some of the questions that were asked up front, I think we're focused more on very fine-grained questions related to specific numbers or like departmental information, which we will get through at the either online, we'll post it, or we will put it into the other forums so that we have a chance to help people with the information they're trying to get a handle on.
Okay, so you'll be responding to those questions through some mechanism. Okay.
We will. Yep.
All right. Just want to say thanks to all the people that were presenting, and thank the 58 people, now 51 people that were still on the call that made it through the entire presentation. That's saying something. So you guys got stamina on your end over there. So I appreciate the people that are showing an interest. But I do think we could talk on this topic for hours and hours and hours, because there's lots of information. We did give you a very high level overview. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. I'm sure we're all happy to kind of talk about how we do things. Thank you very much.
Thank you.